A fisherman stands by the edge of the Sea of Galilee. The water strikes the side of his wooden boat in a steady, rhythmic pulse, who forcefully rebukes the Messiah, earning a devastating and public correction. He confidently draws a sword to fight an entire cohort of soldiers. Paul used the Aramaic name to remind them of their roots. He wanted to preserve the visceral, heavy sound of the original encounter. The Greek text protects the theology, reminding us that Simon's strength is derived entirely from the bedrock he rests upon. But the Aramaic Cephas reminds us that God uses rough, unhewn material to build his kingdom. Simon's stability does not come from his own internal mass. As long as the Petros rests firmly on the Petra, it cannot be moved. The theology spoken at Caesarea Philippi is beautiful. It feels triumphant. Jesus has given Simon a clear identity and a cosmic purpose. The Empire of Rome and the gates of Hades will not withstand what is about to be built. But theology spoken in the daylight is always tested in the dark. Just days after receiving this grand confirmation of his title, the pressure shifts. The theoretical foundation is struck by a terrifying, real-world crisis. The title was given, but the man carrying it was about to discover how fragile human stone truly is. The firelight flickers against the heavy paving stones of the high priest's courtyard. It is the middle of the night, and the spring air in Jerusalem is bone-chillingly cold. A man sits close to the flames, yet hours later, he crumbles in fear, weeping bitterly after denying his teacher to a servant girl warming herself by a fire, extending his weathered hands toward a burning charcoal fire, trying desperately to blend in with the temple guards and servants. He is shivering, though not entirely from the cold. Hours earlier, he had drawn a sword in the olive grove, violently vowing to die for his master. Now, the adrenaline has evaporated, leaving only a hollow, paralyzing dread. Jesus has been arrested, beaten, and dragged inside the grand house for an illegal trial. Simon Peter, the man recently declared the immovable foundation of the coming kingdom, waits outside in the shadows. He is about to face the ultimate test of his new identity. But the attack does not come from a Roman centurion holding a spear. It does not come from an imposing high priest. It comes from a simple servant girl. She looks closely at him in the dim, shifting firelight. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." The rock immediately cracks. He denies it, claiming he does not know what she is talking about. A short time later, another girl notices him, and he is questioned again. The fracture widens as he denies it with an oath. He is not immovable. He is constantly shifting. His faith is real, but his foundation is fractured. This creates a profound tension in the biblical narrative. Finally, the bystanders confront him. They hear his rough, guttural Galilean accent, the very accent that usually spoke the Aramaic word kepha, and they know he belongs with the accused. The heavy, unyielding stone completely shatters. Simon loses all control. He begins to call down curses on himself, loudly swearing to the crowd. I do not know the man. At that exact moment, a rooster crows. The Gospel of Luke records that Jesus, still bound in the courtyard, turns and looks straight at Peter. Simon runs out into the freezing darkness and weeps bitterly. The collapse is total. The Petros has crumbled to dust. Why did the Gospel writers include this devastating and deeply personal failure? Why did the early church, a movement largely led by Peter himself, allow this deeply embarrassing story to be widely circulated across the Roman Empire? Because it proves the central thesis of their message. The kingdom of God is not built on human willpower. If the foundation of the church relied on Simon Peter's inherent courage or emotional resilience, the entire structure would have collapsed on a Thursday night in Jerusalem. His failure is not an unfortunate footnote to the story. It is the absolute proof that the strength of the new temple. Why did Jesus give an unstable, easily shaken man the heaviest, most permanent name in the entire New Testament? Does not originate in the men chosen to lead it. A master builder does not simply take a raw stone from the shoreline and immediately set it into the final wall. The stone must first be struck, The jagged, uneven edges must be violently chiseled away. For Simon, those jagged edges were his deep pride, his impulsive arrogance, and his stubborn belief that he could hold himself together by his own strength. A rock cannot be used for a reliable foundation until it is properly shaped. And for Simon, being shaped meant having his self-reliance completely shattered, as he vanishes into the dark streets of the city, weeping and broken. Simon surely believes the prophecy spoken at Caesarea Philippi is over. The title of rock must be permanently revoked. He has proven himself entirely unworthy of the divine architecture, but he has misunderstood the nature of the builder. Jesus does not discard broken stones. When the resurrected Christ finally tracks down this devastated fisherman to restore him, they meet beside another charcoal fire. Yet, as Jesus speaks to him on the beach, he does not call him rock. The scent of burning charcoal carries across the damp morning air at the Sea of Galilee. It is a familiar, comforting smell, but for the fisherman pulling his boat onto the shore, it must trigger a visceral memory of his darkest night. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The problem is not that the title is unclear. The last time he stood near a charcoal fire, he was in the high priest's courtyard, denying he ever knew the man, who is now waiting for him on the beach. We are in the final chapter of the Gospel of John. The resurrected Jesus has prepared breakfast for his disciples. The tension in the air is thick. Peter has essentially gone back to fishing, retreating to the life he knew before he was ever handed a heavy, impossible destiny. He is a shattered man who believes he has permanently disqualified himself from the kingdom's architecture. Jesus takes him aside. He asks him a question 3 times, carefully matching the 3 denials from the courtyard. But the most revealing detail of this conversation is the name Jesus chooses to use. He does not say, "Peter, do you love me?" He does not use the heavy Aramaic kepha. Instead, Jesus looks at him and says, "Simon, son of John." This is not a demotion. It is a reconstruction. Jesus is taking him all the way back to the foundation, back to the very first moment they met. He strips away the title to remind Simon that his calling was never based on his performance as a rock. The problem is that we read it as a compliment rather than a calling. This is not ultimately a story about human strength. The false foundation of Simon's ego, pride, and self-reliance has been entirely demolished by his failure. Now, the real building can begin. Notice what Jesus requires to rebuild him. He does not ask, "Simon, are you finally strong enough?" He does not ask, "Will you promise never to fail me again?" He simply asks, "Do you love me?" The condition for being used in God's architecture is not unbreakable human willpower. It is relational devotion to the builder. When Simon answers yes, Jesus responds, "Feed my sheep." He is placing the stone back into the wall. This encounter reveals the ultimate truth about the name Kepha. The title was never about Peter's ability to hold himself together under pressure. It was about his willingness to let Jesus hold him in place. Think of how a stone functions in an ancient wall. A single block of masonry does not hover in midair by its own strength. It rests entirely on the bedrock beneath it, and it is held fast by the stones surrounding it. Its only job is to remain where the builder placed it. Simon finally understands this. He realizes that a rock is not a monument to human greatness. It is simply material used to serve others. It is a story about divine architecture. The new name Jesus, assigned to Simon, was not a reward for who he already was. He is no longer the impulsive man trying to prove his own strength. He is a surrendered stone, ready to bear the weight of the early church, because he is finally resting fully on the true foundation. This transformation was not temporary. It fundamentally altered the way he saw the world and the church. Decades later, an older, deeply seasoned Peter would sit down to write a letter to scattered, suffering Christians across the Roman Empire. He would reflect on this exact architectural metaphor to encourage believers facing their own terrifying pressures, and when he finally explains what it means to be a rock, he does not point to himself. Years after the charcoal fire on the beach, an older, deeply seasoned Peter writes a letter to a group of scattered, exhausted Christians, living on the edges of the Roman Empire. When he finally writes down his theology of what it means to be a rock, he does not point to his own authority. He does not brag about his prominent title or his foundational status. Instead, he opens the second chapter of his first letter by pointing directly to Christ. He writes, "As you come to him, it was a complete disruption of who he thought he was. To understand what Jesus was actually doing, we must look past our modern psychological definitions. The living stone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him." Peter takes his own Aramaic title, the heavy, unhewn Kepha, and assigns its ultimate fulfillment to Jesus. Jesus is the true foundation, the bedrock that was struck, rejected by the builders, yet chosen by God. But then Peter turns the focus outward. He looks at his suffering audience, and across the centuries. He looks directly at you. He writes, "You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood." This is where the history becomes intensely personal. Peter finally understood that he was simply the first stone of millions. Every single believer carries the exact same architectural calling. When you look at your own life, what do you see? Perhaps you see a history of impulsivity. Perhaps you see deep cracks formed by anxiety, failure, or grief when the pressure of a sudden crisis hits your family, your health, or your career. What is that pressure revealing? Are you desperately trying to project an image of unshakable strength? Are you exhausting yourself trying to be the solid rock for everyone else, terrified that if you crack, the entire structure of your life will collapse? The story of Peter gives you permission to stop pretending. Of strength. In our culture, a rock is often a metaphor for personal willpower or emotional resilience. Remember the courtyard. Remember the shattered stone. What are you trying to control? What have you mistaken for faith? True biblical faith is not the absence of fear, nor is it the display of flawless emotional strength. True faith is simply resting your full weight on the builder. Your weakness is not a disqualification. It is raw material. In the ancient world, stones pulled from the earth were never perfectly smooth. They were jagged, uneven, and scarred by the elements. A master mason did not throw them away because they were flawed. He chiseled away the dangerous edges, and then he used thick mortar to fill the gaps, binding the broken spaces perfectly into the surrounding wall. God is not looking for believers who can stand alone in an open field to prove how indestructible they are. He is building a spiritual house. Your cracks and imperfections are the exact places where the grace of the builder takes hold, connecting you to the stones around you. You do not need to be an immovable mountain. You only need to let Jesus hold you in place. Millions of these living stones have been gathered across history, pulled from every nation, language, and background. But what is this massive structure actually being built for? We tell people to be a rock for their family during a crisis, implying they must hide their weakness and stand entirely on their own. The answer is not found in the ancient past. It lies at the very end of the biblical story. The journey that began with a single word on the shores of Galilee ends in the final chapters of Revelation. At the very end of the biblical narrative, we find an old man exiled on the rocky, wind-swept island of Patmos. It is John, the same disciple who stood on the muddy shores of Galilee decades earlier and watched Jesus assign a heavy new identity to a volatile fisherman. Now, John is given a vision of the end of human history. In Revelation chapter 21, the heavens open, and he sees the new creation descending. He sees a massive, glowing, eternal city, the New Jerusalem. This city is the ultimate contrast to the dark, terrifying cliff face of Caesarea Philippi. The Roman Empire built its towering marble temples on dead mountains, designed to intimidate and project human dominance. But God's eternal city is built differently. As John describes the staggering architecture of this new world, he looks closely at the base of its massive walls. He writes, "The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. One of those foundational stones bears the name of a Galilean fisherman. The long, painful journey of his transformation is finally complete. He reaches down into the damp earth and pulls up a heavy, unhewn stone from the shoreline. He turns it over in his weathered hands. But in the ancient Near East, stones were not primarily metaphors for human emotion. They were the raw, physical materials of survival. Return to the image where this entire story began. Picture that fisherman standing by the Sea of Galilee, pulling a heavy, unhewn kepha from the damp earth. He turns it over in his weathered hands. He feels its jagged edges, its cold surface, and its sheer, unpolished weight. For years, that man proved how easily he could crack under the pressure of his own fear, impulsivity, and pride. He shattered in the high priest's courtyard because he tried to carry the weight of his calling through sheer human willpower. But look at the stone now. In John's final vision, the foundations of the city are not made of crumbling, fractured rock. They are adorned with precious jewels: jasper, sapphire, emerald, and amethyst. The jagged edges have been masterfully smoothed by a lifetime of grace. The stone is glowing with the glory of God. And most importantly, it is holding up the eternal wall, not by its own independent power, but by its permanent, perfect placement upon the immovable bedrock of the Messiah. This is the grand synthesis of the biblical story. The name Jesus gave to Simon was never a compliment about his inherent stability. This is not ultimately a story about human strength. It is a story about divine architecture. God does not choose you because you are already perfectly formed, emotionally flawless, or entirely unshakable. They were dragged from the earth to build defensive walls, to construct protective sheepfolds, and to anchor the massive foundations of temples. He chooses you because He is a master builder. When you feel the cracks in your own life, when you fail, when you give in to fear, when the overwhelming pressure of your circumstances reveals how fragile your own willpower truly is, do not run into the dark to weep bitterly alone. Return to the builder on the beach. Allow him to strip away the exhausting illusion of your own self-reliance. True faith is not control, it is absolute trust. Let him take your brokenness and set it firmly back into the wall with the mortar of his grace. You do not have to be an immovable mountain. You only have to trust the hands that are shaping you. The unhewn stone has finally become a living foundation. If this study helped you see Scripture and your own calling more clearly, please consider subscribing to the channel. Share this video with someone who feels weighed down by their own failures, and leave a comment below about how God is shaping the rough edges of your own story. A stone was not meant to stand alone in a field to prove its own strength. It was meant to be gathered, shaped, and built upon by someone else. Yet, to truly grasp the weight of what was placed upon this fisherman's shoulders, we have to strip away our modern vocabulary. The English name Peter has become so familiar, so common, that it has entirely lost its physical impact. Even if we understand the Greek translation, Petros, we are still one step removed from the original, world-altering moment. Jesus did not speak English, nor did he primarily speak Greek while walking along the muddy, trade-worn shores of Galilee. To hear what Simon heard on the day his identity was forever altered, we have to listen to the spoken language of first-century Judea. He spoke Aramaic. Step into the loud, dust-choked streets of first-century Judea. The air smells of dried fish, salt water, and burning wood. The people here do not speak in the polished, philosophical Greek of Athens. They speak Aramaic, a guttural, earthy, and deeply practical language, feeling the sharp, jagged edges, the cold surface, and the sheer physical density pulling against his wrists, shared by tradesmen, farmers, and fishermen. According to the Gospel of John, the naming of Simon happens almost immediately, long before his famous confession of faith. Andrew, having just met Jesus, finds his brother Simon and brings him to the teacher. Notice the interaction. Jesus does not ask for a list of qualifications. He does not administer a psychological test of resilience. He does not wait to see if Simon has the emotional stability required for ministry. The text describes a piercing encounter. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas." The English translation usually adds a helpful parenthesis here, which, when translated, is Peter. But in that exact historical moment, the word hanging in the air was Kepha. It is a hard, heavy Aramaic term. If you say it aloud, it sounds like something dense, striking the ground. Kepha. In the ancient world, Kepha was not a common given name. To call a man Kepha was highly unusual, borderline strange. It simply meant rock or stone. It was a piece of the earth. If a first-century builder was constructing a retaining wall, he asked for a kepha. If a traveler tripped on a trade route, he stumbled over a kepha. The English word Peter. Most readers assume that when Jesus of Nazareth looked at this fisherman and named him Rock, he was describing the man's inherent character, functions today exclusively as a formal name, stripped of its earthly origin. But the Aramaic word carried an unavoidable physical reality. This was not a sophisticated, abstract title representing institutional authority or intellectual brilliance. It was a raw, unpolished object. It was construction material. When Jesus looked at Simon and called him Kepha, he was handing him a physical destiny. The translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional sense of utility that we often miss. We tend to view leadership as a matter of intellect, charisma, or strategic vision. But by choosing the word kepha, Jesus was bypassing all those refined categories. He was not looking at Simon's current polish. He was looking at his raw mass. He was looking at a man who could be shaped, struck, chiseled, and eventually placed into a permanent foundation. The timing of this naming is crucial. Jesus does not wait until Simon proves himself worthy of the title. He does not say, "Follow me for 3 years. And if you manage to control your temper and stop speaking impulsively, I will upgrade your name to Rock." The new identity is spoken over him on day 1. It is a prophecy of what the builder will do, not a performance review of what the material has achieved. We think of a rock as solid, dependable, and immovable. When we read the Gospels, we assume Jesus saw a bold, natural leader, a man. Simon is called a rock, long before he ever acts like one. Yet, while the name is given at the very beginning of the journey, its complete meaning remains hidden. For years, the disciples walk the dusty roads of Galilee, watching Simon stumble, doubt, and panic, all while carrying this incredibly heavy, foundational name. The contradiction between the man and his title only grows. Jesus knows that to fully explain what Kepha means, he cannot do it on a flat beach or in a quiet and rural synagogue. He needs a backdrop that makes the sheer physical weight of the name impossible to ignore. He needs an environment dominated by massive, intimidating stone. And so, he leads his disciples far to the north, away from the familiar, comforting waters of Galilee, into a region of pagan empire and dark, sprawling caves. The true weight of the name Kepha would not be understood until they walked into the terrifying shadow of Mount Hermon. The elevation climbs sharply, and the air grows cooler. Jesus and his disciples have walked 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, leaving the familiar towns of Jewish territory to enter a landscape that feels immediately dangerous. They stand in the region of Caesarea Philippi, at the southwestern base of Mount Hermon. Before them rises a sheer, terrifying cliff of solid rock, hundreds of feet high and stretching across the horizon, with a strong internal foundation who could effortlessly carry the weight of a new religious movement without cracking under the pressure. At the base of this massive stone wall yawns a dark, cavernous opening, known in the ancient world as the Cave of Pan. This is not a quiet synagogue. This is a center of pagan worship and Roman imperial power. The sound of rushing water echoes heavily off the stone as the springs of the Jordan River pour out from the earth. Carved directly into the unyielding cliff face are niches, holding statues of Greek deities. Just steps away stands a gleaming white marble temple built to honor Caesar Augustus. To the ancient mind, this dark, watery cave, plunging deep into the bedrock, was considered the literal boundary of the underworld. The locals called it the Gates of Hades. Why bring a group of Jewish fishermen here? Why choose the darkest, most intimidating display of worldly power to have the most important conversation of his ministry? Because Jesus is about to test the foundation. Against the backdrop of an immovable mountain, he asks a question that strips away everything else. Who do you say that I am? The disciples offer the popular rumors of the day: John the Baptist, Eliah, Jeremiah. But Simon steps forward. For a moment, his impulsivity serves him perfectly. He does not hesitate or calculate the risk. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus does not simply validate the answer. He responds by activating the name. We assume the name was a badge of honor for a man who had his life entirely together. But the biblical record reveals a glaring contradiction. He assigned to Simon years earlier on the beach. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Visualize the physical contrast of this scene. Behind Jesus towers a massive, ancient cliff of solid bedrock, supporting a global empire and a pantheon of false gods. But Jesus effectively turns his back on the mountain. He looks at a fragile, unpolished tradesman and declares that this man and the divine revelation he just confessed is the true foundation. He places the fragile, the human rock of Simon, in direct defiance of the terrifying rock of the Roman world. The empire builds its temples on dead mountains. Jesus builds his kingdom on living stones. In the spoken Aramaic of that afternoon, the poetry was unmistakable. Jesus, almost certainly, used the exact same word twice. He would have said, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church." The man and the foundation shared the exact same title. That would already be significant. But the story does not end there. Decades later, when the Gospel of Matthew was recorded and circulated across the Mediterranean, the writer faced a monumental challenge. The original conversation. The man Jesus names Rock is anything but stable. He is famously volatile. He is driven by sudden, overwhelming impulses. Stepping out of a boat was spoken in Aramaic. But the Gospel was written in Greek. How do you translate a heavy Aramaic word into a language with entirely different rules of grammar? The choice the writer made would spark one of the greatest theological debates in Christian history. And it changes how we must read the text today. The translation from Aramaic to Greek creates an immediate problem. A simple, profound conversation spoken at the base of a mountain suddenly becomes a linguistic puzzle. When the Gospel of Matthew was written, the author had to capture the heavy Aramaic word kepha for a Greek-speaking world. But the Greek language, unlike Aramaic, assigns specific genders to nouns. You cannot easily give a man a feminine noun as a proper name without violating the rules of the language. To solve this, the Greek text uses two different but deeply related words, Petros and Petra. Jesus says, "You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church." The English translation smooths this tension over, rendering it simply as Peter and Rock. But the original Greek readers would have heard a subtle, striking difference in scale. Petra, a feminine noun, refers to a massive, immovable shelf of bedrock. It is a vast geological foundation, much like the towering, unyielding cliff face of Mount Hermon standing directly behind them at Caesarea Philippi. You cannot pick up a Petra. You can only build upon it. Petros, a masculine noun, however, generally describes a smaller, individual stone in an act of profound faith one moment, only to sink into the dark water in sheer panic the next. He is a man, It is a piece of rock, a stone that can be picked up, carried, and placed into a wall. It is exactly the kind of unhewn stone a fisherman might pull from the muddy shoreline of Galilee. For centuries, scholars and denominations have debated this grammar. Some traditions elevate Peter himself as the exclusive foundation of the church, while others distance him entirely, insisting the foundation is only his confession of faith. But the linguistic evidence points toward a beautiful integration of both. Simon is a Petros, a single, distinct stone, but he shares the exact nature and substance of the Petra, the foundational bedrock of Christ, and the divine revelation he just confessed. Simon is not the mountain itself. He is the first, crucial stone laid upon it. This distinction was so vital that the Apostle Paul often refused to use the Greek translation entirely. When Paul wrote his letters to the early churches in Galatia and Corinth, he was writing in fluent Greek, yet he frequently bypassed the polished Greek name Petros. Instead, he transliterated the raw Aramaic sound directly into his Greek sentences, calling the apostle Cephas. Why force an awkward Aramaic word into a Greek letter? Because Paul wanted his readers to remember the earthly, unpolished tradesman. When the church in Corinth was fracturing over favorite leaders, some saying, "I follow Paul," and others saying, "I follow Cephas,"